Got an HPDV6000 here. It's having some booting problems, some power problems. We plug the power adapter and we're getting a blue light there on the end. And when we hit the power button, you count off 5 seconds, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. About every 20 seconds, the computer turns off and reboots. Now there's no video on the screen. Only thing that we could tell is happening is the LEDs above the keyboard light up when you hit the power button. The fans go on, I believe, and then it just reboots. So somewhat of a common problem on the DV6000 motherboard issue. So we already have a motherboard bought for this. We're going to replace the motherboard. So we pulled the battery out already, and we're just going to pull the RAM out and the wireless card. Just get all the components off of the motherboard because that's the part we're going to be replacing. Now we're going to pull the hard drive out. There's usually a little plastic tab that allows you to pull the hard drives out easy. Now we're going to take the screws out of the computer that appear to be holding in the hinge cover plate, which is the next part I usually like to take off because it gives us access to the keyboard and the screen. And the DV6000 has a couple screws that hold the keyboard in as well. They have a little icon of a keyboard next to them. There's about 3 of them. And you can't get the keyboard out until you pull those out. And those are the 3 I'm pulling out now. Okay, and then I'm pulling out any possible screw that might be holding that hinge cover plate on. Any screw that's directly under the hinge cover plate that might be holding it on, I like to get out. We got to take these screws out anyway, so. Now these 2 screws in the back on the DV6000 are different size than the other ones, the ones I just showed you there. Most of the other case screws here are pretty much the same length, so we don't have to worry too much about putting the screws back because we know where they go. All the ones of these long length are holding in the covers here. And sometimes I like to do this just since I'm under the laptop here and I know I got to get to the motherboard, I'm just going to pull every screw out, including the ones that are under the hinge cover plate, but might as well get them all out now. Can't hurt. Once we think we have them all out, flip the laptop over, and then let's remove that hinge cover plate. DV6000s are tricky with the hinge cover plate because on the left-hand side, there's a couple cables that are holding it in. So it's nice if you get the keyboard off first. You could have access to those cables, or ribbons, I'm sorry. See those 2 black ribbons are holding the hinge cover plate in, plus there's something that's, I believe, a speaker wire that's holding it down. So be very careful with these. They bend easy. If you bend them at more than a 90-degree angle, they might actually snap. And this orange piece of tape is holding the wireless antennas into the hole that goes through the case there. It brings them into the bottom of the computer. Pull that tape off, and then we could start peeling away the wires for the wireless card, which actually lead up into the screen. So let's see if we can get the hinge cover plate off now. Now that those 2 ribbon cables are loose, there's only one other cable holding it in, a thin little cable right there that I believe is a speaker cable or something of the sort. And then we just follow these wireless antenna along until we get back to the screen. Now we're going to start taking the screen off, and we're going to want to take the LCD cable off that's holding the screen or giving power to the screen before we pull the screen off, which we will do. Okay, these screws I'm taking off now are just the covers of those hinges. There's two little screws holding the hinge covers on. And I'm taking out the touchpad ribbon cable there. Checking if there's any screws on the back of the computer that are holding the screen in. Now we're pulling out the LCD cable. Looks like I'm looking for the correct tool here to use. Sorry about the delay. Just getting a skinny screwdriver to pull off the hinge covers. It's actually not a huge deal if you get these little black covers off. They come off with the screen, so I might give up after a while to get them off. Looks like I am. As long as they're not blocking the screws for the screen, we might be able to leave them on there. We're pulling up the LCD cable and detach that from the motherboard. So now the screen can freely come off. Now we're unscrewing the actual screen itself from the case. And the screen comes off. So we didn't have to take those little black covers off. Now we have some space to work. I love getting the screens off and out of the way because now we could work with a flat surface, not worry about scratching or damaging the screen. And now we're just going to start taking the screws off of the top cover here that appear to be holding the motherboard in and attaching the top cover to the bottom cover, which is going to be almost every screw that you see. Take that back cover panel off there. Gives us access to a couple more screws. And now we should be able to pull the top cover off of the bottom cover. Check if there's any screws that you missed. And once all the ribbon cables and speaker cables and every other cable is detached, all the screws are out, we'll be able to get the cover off. When you start pulling and you feel force, look for screws that are still holding it in. And just gently keep finding spots that will detach. And if you keep working it here and you're finding that it's not going to detach, there's a problem, or there's a screw, or there's something holding the case together. So I'm just inspecting that here, finding out what the problem is. Looks like all the screws are out, so the question is, why is this case not coming apart? Found another screw that might need to come out. And there's actually two little hex nuts right there that the wireless card screws into. Those actually come off, and they keep the top case attached to the bottom case and attached to the motherboard. That's a little trick of a DV6000. I had to edit out the 10 minutes of video of me trying to find that out, but that is the problem there. So once you get those 2 screws out, now we should be able to remove the top cover from the bottom cover very easily and expose the motherboard. So those 2 screws were holding it in. Now if we forced it open, we would have broke something. So take a little time and try to find those things if you have to. Now there's a few screws holding the motherboard on. Now, there's still some force holding it in. We don't want to force anything, so what we're going to end up doing is taking off the remote control holder, which is there in the bottom right hand corner of the computer, and that will allow us to pull the motherboard outwards instead of forcing it like I was doing before. There's 4 screws holding that in. That's going to come up, pull out, and now we can pull up the motherboard from that side. There we go. Make sure all your cables are disconnected. And then we can remove the motherboard. I like to take a vacuum here. And since you have these laptops open, this is a great opportunity to get the dust and dirt out. So I'm just using a Stinger wet dry vac from Home Depot. Smallest one that they have, the little tiny one, which has been a great investment for the shop. And I'm using the brush. Now let's get that motherboard back. We're going to have to pull off the processor and the CPU fan. I like to loosen these screws in like a star fashion, like you're removing a tire, so you're not putting too much pressure on the processor. Then we use a screwdriver to unlock the processor, pull it out. Check over the motherboard, make sure there's nothing else on the motherboard that we need. And once we determine that, grab the new motherboard and get started again. Now, I ordered this motherboard on eBay. The DV6000 motherboards have a model number right under the RAM. And if you do a search for that model number that's right under the RAM, I think it usually ends in like a 0001. There's a little white sticker there, you could see it. that will tell you which model number to get as a replacement. And we just do an eBay search for that, find the replacement, order from a trusted seller, and then usually get a pretty good deal on it. It beats buying it directly from HP. And what we're going to do is put some new thermal grease on the processor and the heatsink. If needed. Sometimes the heatsink will have a thin layer of metal rather than the actual thermal paste, which is just another way of doing heat transfer from the processor to the heatsink. We're going to take a processor, make sure it's lined up. Make sure that the locking screw is set to unlock position before you put the processor in. Processor should just slide right in. Put a little pressure on the processor, then lock it with the locking screw. If you've never done that before, it's very easy. There's a little diagram above the actual screw that shows what position it should be in to be locked. Lock it up. Now we're going to clean off the top of the CPU. And I'm actually just scraping off with my fingernail some of the hardened residue that's on the top of the CPU. A lot of times an overheating CPU can fry a motherboard, and that might be the problem. So we want to make sure that it's okay, and you have a good, strong, heat bond between the heatsink and the CPU itself. And I'm using a paper towel there just to clean off the big chunks, and then I'll hit it with that toothbrush and just get all the little pieces and the fine pieces out of the way. You don't want any of that stuff floating around on top of the motherboard until we get a nice clean connection on there. Hit it with some compressed air. And I want to take the heatsink and the CPU fan outside and hit it with a blast of compressed air before we do anything else. It's another good idea to when you have the fan and you have the CPU out of the computer, clean it then. This way you get all the dust out, and you're not pushing the dust all inside the case and all over the motherboard. You got a clean environment here, so you might as well take advantage of it. Now we're going to take some thermal grease and put a little dab of it on the processor. You don't want to put too much. I'm using Arctic Silver thermal grease. This is actually the ceramic version, but they make a silver version as well. I believe the silver is better quality, but this should be just fine. I'm just making sure the cap is securely back on there so it doesn't spill out in the drawer. And then I take a piece of Scotch tape, and this is the best way I've found to do this. A piece of Scotch tape, I put it over my finger long ways. And I kind of paint the processor with the grease on the Scotch tape, then throw the Scotch tape out. This way I don't get it all over my finger. Just to make it more of an even coat. I guess I got a little on my finger, but... And I'm just cleaning up around the edges. I like to be a little neat when I put the grease on the processor. Now we're going to take the heatsink and fan and put it back on. It's a common thing to forget to attach the fan to the motherboard, the wire, the power for the fan to the motherboard. So I always like to do that first, just in case I forget, because you don't want that to happen where the fan is not connected. And then I like to do this in a crisscross pattern, screwing the heatsink back onto the processor. Because I don't like to put, if you just take one side and screw it all the way down, I feel like it puts too much pressure, and you want a nice even pressure put on the processor. You don't want it to get messed up anyhow. Just like putting a tire on and taking a tire off, that's how I attach these screws. And I don't over tighten, just nice and snug. Now it's time to put the motherboard back into the bottom case. There's still a little dust there in the heatsink. So, like I said before, since you have the motherboard out and the fan out, the heatsink out, clean it up while you can. I'm just using a toothbrush to get in between the fins there. Especially if it's a smoker's computer, it gets real sticky in there, so you might have to use something like a toothbrush. Sorry, it's out of frame a little bit there. I'm actually going to take the vacuum as well with the brush attachment like we used earlier and use that to get the rest of the stuff out of the heatsink. Just want to make a nice clean, way for the air to pass through. Okay, we're back now. The heatsink is clean. It's time to put the motherboard back into the computer. Just make sure you have it lined up properly. It only goes in one way. And I'm going to attach these cables first, which is the power. It actually goes to the circuit board where the power adapter plugs into. And then this other cable, which I believe is for that USB port and maybe the Ethernet port that's on that separate circuit board as well. Maybe not the Ethernet, I think it's just the USB. And as I put pieces back together, I like to just clean them up. Take a paintbrush, clean paintbrush, preferably one that's never been used with paint, and just dust everything off. Now we're going to flip this around. I'm probably going to put it in at an angle, which is usually how the motherboards kind of go in. They put them in at an angle and then lay them down flat once the angle is achieved. And that's not quite in, so let's see if we can push it down and snap it in. Okay, all the connectors look like they're in. Now we're just going to try to lay the other part flush. If the motherboard's not laying flush like it was when you first took it out, then check for connectors under the motherboard that's holding it in. And there was a little cable stuck under there that was causing it not to lay flush. I'm taking a little bit of time here because it still doesn't seem like it's seating in properly. And you don't want it to arch up at all because then you know something's wrong. And then when you screw everything back together, you could actually be damaging the motherboard. Then once you're confident everything's lined up, you can start putting the screws back in. Right now I'm looking at the connectors through the holes in the side, making sure they're in properly and completely lined up. It still seems like there's something under there causing a problem. Okay, and it looks like we got everything laid flush now, so we're going to put the pieces back. Starting with the remote controller holder. Just going to put those 4 screws in. That actually holds in the motherboard too from that side, so that's why it's important to get that in after we get the motherboard back in. All the holes are lined up, everything's looking good. You want to make sure by my thumb there is the wireless, my left thumb, there's the wireless switch. You want to make sure that that switch is seated back in properly when you put the motherboard in. Otherwise, when you try to flip the wireless switch on while the computer's put back together, it might not be grabbing the switch. So that's something you want to make sure of. You don't want to have to take the computer all apart because of that reason. Now we're going to start putting the screws in the motherboard. Looking for any other screws with a white arrow next to it. Those are usually the ones that you have to put back in. Now there's a lot of open screw holes, as you can see on the motherboard. I didn't put screws back in. That's because they are fastened in through the case. So anything that doesn't have a white arrow, usually on the motherboard, leave that screw hole open because that's going to get screwed in later in the process of putting everything back together. Make sure that the top case fits back on properly. And I had to take that one screw out because that screw actually screws through the top of the case into the motherboard. So just want to check. That's why I'm looking over everything, making sure all the holes are lining up. Then just push around the edges of the case, make sure everything snaps in. And then start putting screws back. And now these screws are actually going through those open holes in the motherboard like I was talking about before. I'm going to start putting screws in the bottom. Starting with these 2. They're actually hex nuts which provide the screw holes for the wireless card. They're like standoffs. That's what they look like, little standoffs. Just wanted to get that started. Sometimes I do that with a Phillips head screwdriver. And then I use the hex nut to put it back in. Now it's time to just put all the screws back in. Now I'm going to speed this up just to save you from some boredom. going to put that rear plate back on, which there's only one screw holding that rear plate on, that little strip, right there on the right hand side. So it's going to find the right size screw. Get the screen on. Attach the screen with the 4 screws. And then I use a bigger screwdriver to tighten it up and get some torque. You don't want those screws that hold the screen on to get loose. Then the screen flops around. Now the trick is to feed the wireless antennas back at the same path that was originally there. And these DV6000s have a little metal tabs you bend up, and then you bend them back down once you get the wire in place. It makes everything flush. Otherwise, the keyboard's going to be popping back out a little bit. It's kind of a pain to follow the path, but it does make it through. So, and then you feed it right back through the hole in the bottom. And the power board here has these 2 ribbon cables you got to be very careful with. And that little speaker cable right at the beginning there. We're going to feed these ribbon cables back into the connectors. Be very careful on the DV6000 when you reattach these ribbon cables. You don't want to bend them. They will break very easily. So just be very careful. Kind of inch them in if you have to. Use whatever means you have to. Just be very gentle. It doesn't look like I'm being gentle as this is going fast, but trust me, I'm taking my time with it. And then again, these have metal tabs. You pull them up, and the ribbon cables sit under the metal tabs. And then make sure you put the metal tabs back down. Otherwise, again, the keyboard will not be flush when you put the keyboard back on. Keyboard snaps in. Now, there's no screws holding the keyboard in from the top. They're all coming through the bottom. So once you get the ribbon cable for the keyboard in, it's going to slide right in and sit flush. Right under that hinge cover plate. Flip it around. Screwing the keyboard in now. And screwing the plate in now. Putting all the remaining screws in the bottom. We're attaching the wireless antenna, putting in the hard drive, putting in the CD drive, usually held in by 1 screw, putting the RAM back in, putting that plate for the RAM back on. Make sure everything's flush, put the battery back in. Plug in the power, flip it on, cross your fingers if you want to. Get happy when you see all the lights come on, and then look for your video to come up. And there it goes. That's normal for the DV6000 taking that long for the video. It's a little scary though when you attach a motherboard and you're waiting for that. Well, that's how you do a motherboard replacement on a HP DV6000.